Hello there. In this rather beefy episode, I'm going to show you how I'm setting up animated particle systems in Blender. I've recently put this little animation together to commemorate the closure of Microsoft's Mixer streaming service and all the wonderful times that we've had there. And I thought it might be nice to put a little animation together in which the robot basically kicks the Mixer sign and waits for the plug to be pulled by Microsoft there. And in order to make the scene really come alive, I've added these wonderful, not only a bit of background action, but also these wonderful particle effects to the scene. So they're kind of out of focus and they're going all over the place. And we see this effect in video games all the time when there's little flies buzzing around lamps and all that. And this is all done with Blender. So the assets are on the robot on the right hand side. That is from 3D Universe. That's an old asset for DAZ Studio, really. I brought him into Blender, animated him with Mixer mode blocks, and then I've animated the Mixer sign. That was an SVG that Microsoft provided. So I picked the colors from their corporate identity, and yes, that's how I did that. But the particles can also be used for all kinds of other things, and it's a very complex process to get this going, to set this up, but it is kind of nice once you have it. So this is another example of using that. So you can have these out of focus things that just create some kind of a generic animated moving background there. So this type of thing is what we're going to set up today, and there's a lot of steps to it. I've added chapter points to the description, so you can go to, rather than splitting this video up into several episodes, I've left it all in one episode, and you can jump to the chapter points if you wish. Also, Patreon supporters of mine will get access to the scene file we're creating today, so that will be included for Patreon supporters. I'm going to put a link in the description to that, and I will also provide written instructions to this video so that we all know how that works at a glance. That is pretty much it. Let's get going with Blender 2.83. I'm going to not actually delete the default cube. Default cube will be with us for the whole duration of the scene. In fact, he's going to be the star of the show. All I'm going to do is move him up. So I'm going to go and press GZ1 and enter, and that will put him right on to our floor here. And so, as I said, he's going to be the center of the show. So in principle, what will happen is that the cube will be the emitter of the particles. They'll be emitted from the cube, and the camera is going to look through the cube. So that's perhaps a good way to get started, to set up the camera the way I wanted that. But the camera, since it's going to be 16 by 9, I'm going to scale the cube up a bit with S and Y, and I'm just going to make it a bit longer. And I might also just, that's actually fine. That's all we need to do. With the 0 on the numpad, I can look through my camera, and on the view tab, if I use this little tick box here, lock camera to view, I can go and just frame this up to something like that. There. Or thereabouts. It doesn't have to be absolutely accurate, but so that we're basically having a side view of the cube. That's the idea. That's what we're gonna see. So with that set up, let's also, before we get going, let's add a bit of light here. We're going to use the default light also, not going to be deleted this time. GX, we'll just move that over to the kind of in the middle here, and then we're going to use GY to move that over to the side to about here. And with that light selected, let's just go turn it into a spotlight. And this will give us this kind of volumetric effect, as if a light shines through this volumetric fog, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to turn it around so that it shines directly at the cube. So RZ to about here. Again, it doesn't have to be absolutely accurate. We're almost there. Maybe GY, move it over to here, and just make that spotlight a little bit smaller. So the size, I'll turn the size down so that it's literally just shining at the cube like that. There we go. That's technically our scene. That's all the setups that we need to worry about. So we can play with the values, with the kind of intensity of the light. That's all going to happen later. Let's turn our focus now to cranking these particles out. So that all happens on our cube. So I'm going to leave it cube for now, but you can rename that, of course, to something like emitter or whatnot. I'm going to leave it cube for now. And if we go to the sidebar here with the cube selected, there's this little icon that looks like, I don't know, 3 little lines coming out of a spot. And that is the particle tab. Currently, there's nothing in there. I might just make that a bit bigger. There's nothing in there. If I hit the plus sign, I'm going to set up a particle system. And that's great. That's all I need to do. Now we have like thousands of settings here. Don't be freaked out about them. There's a lot that we don't need, and only a few of these we do need. And those are the ones I'm going to highlight in this process. Since we're dealing with animated particles, I'm going to go and turn this into, say, a 250 frame animation. That's the default. But right now I only want to see the first 50 frames. So I'm going to shorten that animation there. Press the spacebar to start the animation, just so that we can have a look what's happening here. And it looks like without doing anything, the thing's already producing some kind of particles. That's awesome. These are generic, so they are called halos, and Blender just produces them. We can replace them with real geometry of our choice later. But for now, these give us an impression of what the particles are going to look like. Now notice that the particles are not behaving like the ones I've shown you in the beginning. These seem to fall down, and that's the first thing that we need to fiddle with, and that happens on this long list of things under something called field weights. Down here, if I open that, I have this tab here, which is called gravity, and that's set to 1, and that pulls the particles down, and hence they fall. If I set that to 0, that's kind of a bit better. So nothing's falling down anymore, and everything's kind of just floating out. And that's, also okay. That's interesting, but it's also not quite what we want. Also, if the gravity is 0, what other force might be invoking this movement on our particles? That is happening under the velocity tab. We see a normal of 1 meter per second, and that is exactly what generates that movement. I'd like to make sure the particles don't move at all with the particle emitter. I would just like for the particle emitter to produce them, and then I'll introduce something else that makes the particles move. So let's set normal to 0 as well, and that would mean our particles are now frozen in place. However, what isn't quite working is that I don't see all the particles at once. I see them kind of popping into place over a period of time. And notice if I put this back to 250 frames now, I will see that they will pop into place. They kind of move around. Some disappear, some reappear. And that is also not what I want. I would like all particles to appear at the same time. And then I would like for them to just stay there. That's what I'd like. I'm going to press Shift Z actually, so that we get rid of that we go into this kind of ghost view in which we only see the particles. That might be easier to visualize this. So what's happening here is that on the top here, where we're setting up the particles, we've got these settings here, frame start and frame end. And that is literally what's happening here. My particles are being created from frame 1 to frame 200, and they have a lifetime of 50 frames. So I would like for them, first of all, to have a lifetime of 250 frames. I don't want them to disappear at all. I would like for them to last as long as my animation is. I would also like for them to start on frame 1, but I would like for them to also end on frame 1. So I'd like for them all to appear at frame 1. So let me do that. And that is kind of the state I'm looking for here. They all happen, and that's it. And they all last until the end of my animation. That is exactly what I want. All particles at once. Perfect. Number is the number of particles I have, so I could reduce that to half the size of the particles, or to quite a few. The default is 1,000, but you can crank that up or down. We're going to get a better impression of how many particles we need when we have our own geometry going. So for now, I'm going to leave that at 1,000, which is just the default. Okay, great. Let me stop the animation with space. Put this back to frame 1, and let me go and introduce this mysterious force that's going to make our particles wobble now, and that is called a turbulence force. If I press Shift A, I go to this bottom thing here that says force field, and what we need is indeed a turbulence force. So that'll be in the center of the scene. Our cube is not in the center of the scene. It's kind of just at the, rising up from the top. So that means if I now press space, the force field doesn't seem to have any effect. And that is because it needs to be kind of in the middle of our particles. Oh, look at that. Towards the end, it does have an effect. But up until that point, there's kind of nothing's happening for about, whatever, 200 frames, and then it starts happening. So let me go and grab this and move it up with GZ kind of halfway into the cube here. There we go. And now the frozen in place particles are being moved around. Oh, there's one coming through us. It's crazy, crazy. This is kind of going into the direction of what we like. If we look through our camera, this is what we would see, and that is already pretty cool for something that we've just cobbled together, but it's a bit too fast for the dust particles. I'd like for them to be much slower and much more subtle. And that is now not an adjustment we make on the particle emitter. That is an adjustment that we make on the force field here. So I might just rename that here. And from field, I'm going to call that just turbulence. Like so. And then we know what it is. It has a little settings field, which is this little circle, like a dot with a little circle on the outside. That is where we find a couple of settings that are interesting for us. I'll go back to kind of the full view here. There's two things that we should pay attention to. One is the strength value and one is the flow value. You'd think perhaps if the particles move too fast, maybe we're just going to go and crank down the strength to something like 0.2 to make it all very subtle. But watch what happens then. It kind of starts out very slow, and that's kind of what we want. But as time progresses, it looks like things are being a little bit too fast again. So it also doesn't quite start at a value that is consistent with the whole movement that I'd like to have. So the strength slider, I recommend you leave that on 1 and instead pay attention to the flow slider. Flow is kind of works the opposite way of how you think it would work, like many things do in Blender. So if you increase the flow, the speed of the flow kind of actually reduces, which is weird. So if I crank that up to 2, then we'll see that the particles seem to float much slower now, and also they don't start slow and then accelerate. They kind of keep as slow as I might like them to be. 2 might be just a bit too slow, so if I turn that down to about 1, that's probably more of what I'm looking for here. There we go. That's already super hypnotic, so I can totally just watch this all day and be super happy with this without doing anything else with this. But that's just me. Now the real fun begins when we replace these little dots with our own geometry, and we'll do that now. Something that looks more like dust platelets. Let's go and stop the animation and just go out of this again. And then of course there's materials as well. We're going to set up that as well. But for now, let's go replace these generic circles with our own geometry. I'm going to go and make the cube disappear for now. And in fact, I'm going to make the turbulence disappear as well, so that we have a bit of a clearer viewport here. And I'm going to create my own particle. Shift A, it'll be a mesh, and I'm going to choose an icosphere. You can create your particles from anything you like. Icosphere works quite well. If I go into the start menu here, I'll turn the subdivisions down to 1, and that makes the geometry, light and easy. That's really what we want. I'm also going to go and press Shift Z again so that we get into the solid viewport again. And because I don't want this to be in the center of my viewport, I'll press G followed by Y, and I'll just move that out of the way here. Just out of the way, somewhere. There. And let's put our best modeler face on. I suck at modeling, but a dust particle I can just about manage. So tap into edit mode, press A to deselect everything, and I'm just going to go grab this vertex here, GZ, to pull that down. I'll do the same with the bottom vertex here. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece, it'll be very small anyway. GZ like so, and then I'm going to go toggle this with A and just make the whole thing flatter, like a kind of a disc. So SZ, will scale that along the Z axis, and that's kind of, maybe that's a dust particle. I mean, you can put any kind of randomization in there. You can just grab this guy and it just move that over here. It doesn't really matter. You can create several particles as well. I'm just going to go and use this one for now, and then perhaps we're going to add, for more randomization, just to show you the principle, I'll add a second one later that I'll make maybe from a cube. But for now, I'll leave this as it is. It's currently called icosphere. I might just call that a particle. Or perhaps, because we're already saying perhaps we're going to make another particle, let me call this one particle 1. There we go. Let's bring our cube back and our turbulence, and let's see how we can replace all these things with our particle. Actually, maybe before we do that, because it's easier to see when we're in a kind of solid view. If we go into the transparent view, that would mean we're also going to see a transparent version of our particle, and that's just going to look messy. So perhaps bear with me here while we quickly set up a material for our cube. That might be interesting as well. So the material for the cube, if I go back into solid view, I see the cube. I don't really want to see the cube. I'd like to, if I go into my rendered view version here, I still see the cube because the cube has an outside material. I don't really want that. I don't want to see the cube. I just want to have the cube there so that it can emit particles. So I'm in Eevee, so that's why my solid view looks the way it looks. It looks, it looks nice. It looks real-timey. But the principle will also work with cycles. But I'll stick with Eevee for now. I'm using the default settings here, Eevee viewport 16 samples. And with my cube selected, I'll head over to the materials tab down here, and I'll see that the tab that's open already is here, the surfaces tab, and the surface currently has the principled BSDF shader applied, like it has with new objects that you create. I don't actually need that, so I'm going to do something really scary that I didn't even know you could do. You can remove the whole surface shader from the cube. And if you do that, there's literally nothing that's being displayed. So currently it's just black because we don't see a surface. We just see a black thing there. What I'm really interested in is adding a volume shader to this. And that's the tab right at the bottom here. I'll close surface down. I don't think I need that anymore. And I'll pick, and again, I didn't know that that was possible. You pick a principled volume shader now. That is exciting. And watch what happens when you do that. It looks like the cube is completely disappeared. And when we look through it, we can now see in the rendered viewport, we can now not see the cube anymore. We can see straight through it, which is awesome. We're going to play with the parameters here later a little bit, particularly the density. But right now, this is exactly what we want. Notice that this only works in the rendered view. So if I go back into the solid view, my cube comes back because it's just a preview of the cube. But if we go into the rendered view, then it's no longer there. I believe the material preview also works. Yeah, that also works. So if you don't want to use the rendered view, you can also use this. And you do not see your cube, but you see the effect that the cube has. And you can also see your particle, which is awesome. Now, with the cube still selected, let's replace our generic particles with the one that we've made. So once again, cube selected, go back to the particle system. And down here, I'm going to close some of these things down, emission particularly. I'll go over to the render option. And here we can see this thing that now says render as halo. So every particle is being rendered as this little white ball there. But if we take that drop down here, I can also pick an object. And that's exciting because that means I can now go and select which object I want. The instance object in my case is particle number 1. And you can probably guess how we're going to create multiple particles that we've made in this project, namely by, instead of selecting an object, we could also select a collection. So if we put several particles in a collection, then the whole collection, whatever is in the collection, will be reproduced as particles there. We might do that later. For now, this is what I like. I'll go look through my camera, I'll press play, and I'll see that now my own dust particles are being reproduced, which is nice. They all look exactly the same, so that's not very, that's not very realistic. So let's go and work on that. First of all, we can work on the scale. If we want to make them a bit smaller or a bit bigger, we can do that. I might just leave that. I think the default was at 0.5, so I might turn this down to 0.2. Whoops, was that actually 0.05? Was that it? Yeah, there we go. So if I go and turn that to 0.02, that's probably more like the particle effects that that if I wanted them to be dust particles, that's probably more what I'd like to see. But again, they look very uniform, so I'm thinking let's apply a bit of randomization to it. The first thing we might want to do, actually I'm going to leave them at 0.05 just so that we can see this better. I'll go and tick the rotation box here, and that, if I open that up, it will let me pick on the orientation axis. It will let me pick something other than velocity here. I'm going to pick normal, and I'll crank up the randomized value. So the normal, the surface of the normals is now going to be randomized. The rotation of the surface normals is now going to be randomized. I can also randomize the phase at which this has happened. So this is now going to create like a complete randomized thing there, which is nice. But currently they all have the same scale. So that's another element of randomization that I'd like to add there. Some particles should be larger than others, and that is happening, I believe, under the render option. So down here we have the scale and the scale randomness. So scale, we've just talked about that, but scale randomness is the one that I can crank up, and now things are being literally randomized in size. So 0 means no randomization, 1 means full randomization. And this means I can now go ahead and maybe adjust my scale accordingly. If I now see things are being a bit, too small or too big, you can adjust that as you see fit. While we're at this stage, it's also a nice idea to have a look at the very top tab here under emission and see if 1,000 particles is the correct number. If you're kind of happy with the size and with the flow of the whole thing, you can then go and adjust this accordingly. So if this is a bit too much, you can turn this down to 500 maybe, or even something less. I'll leave it at 1,000 for now, because there's another visual effect that will influence the amount of particles we actually see, and that is the depth of field. Depth of field, that's a camera effect, and that can only be seen in the rendered viewport. So I'm going to go and switch over to that, which also lets us see the beautiful volumetric lights that we're getting here now. I think we may have to adjust the light to be a little bit further at the top, otherwise we get this dark corner here. I might do that right now. I'll go and select the light, and that was, I believe, RX, was it? RX, and there we go. Yeah, there we go. There's that dark corner gone. But also, if you like something like that introduced, feel free to fiddle with the light. Speaking of light, actually, there's so many things that come together, don't they? Speaking of light, the particles can't actually be seen very well in the light. And that is because they are currently not really emitting or reflecting any light. I mean, they're there, I can see that, and I can see this better if I go into the material preview. I can see the particles whizzing around there. But if I go into the rendered viewport, I can't really make them out very well. And that is because we might just add a tiny bit of an emission light to the particles. That'll just make them stand out a bit. If you want to get creative, you can also give several particles different types of light. That's how I made this little bokeh effect, that you have several types of light in there. We're going to stick with one, select the particle, and go onto the Materials tab, and just create a new material. I might call that Particle Material. And we don't need the volume shader for that. We need the surface shader now, which is the principal BSDF, which is what we want. Slightly further at the bottom here, we can crank up the emission value and a color if we want. Don't go over the top. We don't want it to be completely white, I guess, but something in the kind of 75%. It kind of depends on what you're going for. If it's a warmish type scene, let's go and make the particles a bit warm as well. So not 100% color, but just give them a tiny bit of a spin. Depends on what you're going for. You could make the light warm, you can make it cool. Kind of depends on the look that you want. But the point of the material on the particles is that we can now see it a little bit better. And now that I do look at the particles, I feel they're not as many as I perhaps like them to be. So I can go back to my cube here, to the particle system, and just go and crank up the number of particles that we're making it to maybe 500. So we just see them a little bit better. That might not be perfect for the final scene. I just want to get a bit of a better visualization for the whole thing. Now, if we stop the animation here, we can see every particle is in focus, and we can even make out the kind of the crooked shape that I've built here. They all look very random, which is great. That's what we want. But right now it doesn't look very elegant. So no matter if we have the overlays active here or not, it doesn't look swish. If I go and render the scene now, it's everything is just kind of harsh, and I'm not getting that soft dreamy look here. I'm getting the volumetrics, sure, but I'm getting harsh edges, and I don't really like to see that. So what we can do is introduce a bit of camera depth of field effect here, and that is happening when I select my camera under the camera tab down here, and there's this tick box depth of field, and it works really well in Eevee. So right now we're not really focusing on anything. I can use this slider here to get my focal distance correct, and while it does work, it's a lot of guesswork here. What I'd like to do is to introduce something called a focus helper. That's an empty object that I'll place anywhere in the scene, kind of in the middle, but I can then adjust its position forward or backwards, and then ask the camera to look at that for its focal point. And that's really nice. So let's do that. Introduce, maybe go back into the material preview. Actually, I'm going to go into this thing so I can see, and I'm going to bring my overlays back too, so I can see what I've actually got selected here. So I'm going to go and hit Shift A and create an empty. Any empty will be fine. Maybe this one here, plain axis, is fine. And I'm going to call this guy, instead of empty, I'm going to give him a name of focus helper. And with that selected, I'll go bring him up a little bit, much like the force field here. Focus helper goes kind of in the middle of the cube. Then with our camera selected, I'll go and ask the camera to focus on the object that I've just created, which is the focus helper. And now if I go look through the camera and look through the rendered viewport again, I can see that if I go and grab the focus helper and hit G and X, I can move this guy forward or backwards. And as I do that, I get kind of a visual indication with the particles when they are out of focus and when they're in focus. So that helps me determine that. It's like I feel like being a focus puller on a film set now. But the depth of field effect itself isn't very pronounced, and especially if we had a character in our scene, you might want to put that focus helper on the character. So in the robot scene that I've made, that focus helper would be somewhere where the robot is, or on the mixer logo, or wherever your point of interest lies. So we're just using it to get an effect going, but if you're combining this with an actual scene, then your focus helper would be in a particular place, namely where we want the actual focus to be. To emphasize this effect, I'll go and select the camera again and just give it a much wider aperture. So the real life apertures, it's not exactly like that in 3D. Sometimes we have to go through extremes to emphasize an effect that we'd like to highlight. So 2.8 is a fairly wide aperture, but there are lenses, real life lenses, that have an even wider aperture. I believe Stanley Kubrick shot a movie once with lenses that had an f-stop of 0.7 or something, which is crazy. I didn't even know that existed, but I forgot the title of the movie actually. But it looks absolutely interesting, and he did this all with just candlelight and interior, so phenomenal what you can do there. So f-stops, they kind of go to 1, and then anything that goes to 0, that's almost taking more light in than is currently in the room. It's kind of a weird principle. But anyway, we can use that to our advantage because Blender calculates it correctly. So if I go and set the f-stop to 1, then I can see that my particles get much more out of focus, and the depth of field effect is getting a lot more pronounced. But I can even go to something like 0.5. And now you can see everything is kind of soft and dreamy. That's exactly what we want from this render. So if I now go and take my focus helper again and hit G and X and move it back and forth, you can see how much of a pronounced effect this has on my particles. I can barely make out what the particles once looked like. And if you go to real extremes like this, you get some really cool effects here because they're all animated now. So if you press space, you get this all as a real-time animated effect. So this is not exactly what we're looking for, but if I head over with the focus helper selected still with G and X, and I'll go and bring this slightly further back, then again you can see that the particles are now beginning to look like what I've shown you in the beginning with my mixer animation. There, dreamy dust particles. And like I said, if you want to use this, if there are too many particles or they're moving too fast, you can go and adjust these values now. So if you select the cube and head over to the particle settings, you can adjust the number of particles with this value. So number, maybe we'll halve that to 250, because in real life scenes there might not be that much dust around. So maybe even something like 100 would be fine. If you don't like the way the particles are distributed, there's also a way to deal with that. So like right now, I've got this one guy floating around in the middle here, and I'm kind of happy with the overall scene, but I'm not so happy with the distribution of these guys. That is also switchable by going back into the cube and onto the particle system. There's this thing here at the top under emission. There's the seed, the random seed value that the randomness of these particles is being created with. And you can just change that, and then the position of all particles is being changed. And you can change that as many times as you like until you find something that you're happy with. And you can then even bring that back. So if I go back to 0 now, I should see my guy in the middle again that I'd rather get away from. So that seed can be adjusted to your needs. It can even be animated, which is awesome. I didn't really want to do that. So sorry about that. I just wanted to hack in a number here. Sorry, I got a couple of pixels to the other side here. So if you found a seed that works for you, I'll pick any old seed. I'll pick number 15 here. There's something else I wanted to bring to your attention that happens when you watch the animation slider, the playhead going back and forth. So right now it's orange, and that is because everything that's orange, that has been cached in memory. But only in memory. If I make an adjustment, say to the seed, and I switch it back to 14, then you can see that the thing that is about to happen has not been cached, but the thing that Blender's just displayed has been cached. So this is something, this is Blender working out where the particles are going to be live as it plays it back. And once it's done that, it remembers where that is. But if you were to save the scene and then come back to it later, it'll have to do that calculation again. It doesn't really remember what it's done there. This is only cached in memory. But there is a way for us to bake the animation into place. So if I wanted to render this out and I come back later and I say, hey, actually I need frame 147 to 170 again, then it would be beneficial if Blender wouldn't have to work out where those particles were, because they might not be appearing in the same positions. So for this, I can go over to the cache parameter here. And that's, again, this is on the cube, under the particle system, under cache. And here I can ask Blender to bake all these particles in, and if I do that, watch what happens. The color changes yet again to like a darker orange. You can even make sure it gets baked to disk, so as soon as you save your file you can bake it, and then you can select disk cache. It's currently grayed out. It's because I haven't saved my file. Let me go do that real quick. This is one of those things that I wish I knew when I explored this. I'll call this particles and I'll say save. And now I can see that this is no longer grayed out, so I can go and tick that box and tick that box. And now I can set a compression here if I wanted to, but now this is being saved to disk. So if I go and I can delete the bake, or I can calculate to frame or whatnot. So I can, once I've calculated it, it will persist as far as I know. One last thing, as promised, let's see how we can make more than one particle appear in our scene. Let me go back to my solid view here, and I'll zoom right out and bring my overlays back and go to my first particle here. There it is. Let me go and create a second particle and morph that in a similar way, and then add it to the particle emitter, just so that we know how that works, just so that you've seen it. I'll go and create a new object. Maybe I'll create a cube this time. I'll go and bring that next to my other particle here. I might just go and scale that down a bit. And maybe I'll scale that up a little bit. And I'll call this one Particle 2. There we go. And I'll go into edit mode here and just make some amendments to it. So perhaps I'm going to go and squish it down slightly. So SZ, make it flat. And I'll go and bring in the edges a little bit. So again, nothing fancy, just, you know, I might do this and then that, G Shift Z, and perhaps even on the bottom the same thing there, just so that we have a slightly different kind of particle here. I don't know if it's good or not. I can never tell. So with this particle also, let's go and create a new material on it. I'll call it Particle 2 or Particle 2 material rather. And also make sure that's not a capital A there. Perfect. And perhaps on a Particle 1, I might just go and copy this material and then apply it to my second material. So they're going to look exactly the same, paste material, but then I have the choice of changing that into something else. So if I wanted to use a different kind of emission color and turn that into something, I don't know, more purple or more blue perhaps, I don't know, we'll see what it looks like. So right now, in order to add both of these to the same particle emitter, I need to have a new collection up here and then put both particles into that collection. So let's make that happen. Under collection, I'm going to right click and say new collection at the top root level here. That creates another collection underneath it. If you're in this collection, it would create a collection inside a collection. I never know how to get them out of there. So I'd rather prefer to create new collections on the top root thing here that says scene collection. If you right click there, it creates a new root collection. I'm sure there's a way. I haven't found out how to do that. I'm going to call this collection particles, and I'll move both my particles in there. So select the first one, shift select the second one, select M and move it to the particles collection. And it doesn't change the position of the particles itself, but it will now put them into this particles collection. And so now if I go and select my cube again and go to the particle system, close all this down again, under render, instead of render as an object, I can go and say render as a collection. And the collection is now going to be the particles. So with a bit of luck, if we go look through our camera again in the rendered viewport, we should now see the other particles as well. I can just about make the purple ones out here. That is kind of nice. Yeah, so now I've got yellow ones and I've got purple ones, and you can have as many particles as you like and put them in that collection, make the whole collection bigger, smaller, add other stuff to it, and that is how you get several other types of particles. I'm going to go render this out in Eevee, and then we're going to have a look in my next video how to loop this animation seamlessly. Watch out for that. Sorry it's gone a bit long, but it's one of those things that I thought we'll really need to take some time over and explain this thoroughly. There's just so many steps to it, but once you've done it 2 or 3 times, it really grows on you, and these particle effects, they can be used to great effect in both animations and in still images. As I said, Patreon supporters will get full access to this scene file if you want to dissect it and have a play with it or generate your own. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask in the comments. If I do know the answer, I might even tell you what it is. But if I don't, I'm just going to be open and say, hey, Blender is so complex, I really don't know much about it. But I've figured this one out. I thought I'll share it with you. That was it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.